I found the unpublished memoirs of my great-great-grandfather who served in the Philippines. One of the chapters terrifies me. Wednesday brought us to another village that looked just like all the rest. Dusty dirt paths, flimsy nipa huts, and a single stone chapel, the trademarks of every native village. Marching in and halting for a rest, we were greeted with the same mixture of fear and curiosity the Indians gave us no matter where we went. We were an oddity to them, as much as they were to us. Resting under the shadow of the abandoned chapel, Morgan, Harry, and I leaned against its mossy stone walls and watched as the Indians slowly and cautiously got out of their homes and crowded around our men. Staying a safe distance away, they stared at us, and we stared at back them. Paying not much mind towards the natives, I quickly grew bored of the staring match and instead went into a conversation with Morgan and Harry about home. Our 18-month enlistments were almost up at this point, and word was that the regiment would be sent home in 3 months. Because of that, all that any soldier in the unit could think of was home. After over a year of service in these disease and insurgent-filled islands, the thought of finally getting to leave felt like such a relief. We had our taste of fighting, we'd had our fair share of glory, we did our part for our country, after accomplishing all of that we wanted to be sent home. Such thoughts often filled my mind, as my tired and weary body prayed for a time that I won't have to worry about day-long marches under the tropical sun or suffer through nights where I have to force myself to sleep while trying to ignore the mosquitoes and internal worries about lurking insurgents in the shadows. Every day brought us closer and closer to that sought-after date. But with that thought in mind, the closer we got to the day, the more anxious everyone got. After all, no one wanted to be killed by an insurgent or struck by disease so close to the moment of return. Because of that, everyone, myself included, seemed to always be on the edge during picket duty, and often took extra care in maintaining hygiene, or else catch the cholera that has been plaguing this backwater corner of the world. However, some men were more nervous than others, and on that hot summer day, with tempers short and anxiety high, one member of the regiment erupted into a fit of paranoia. This paranoia ended up causing a little incident that morning, when a certain Private Jason Harrington from Company B started pestering a native girl after she, apparently, looked at him in a peculiar way. In my opinion, she was just probably staring at him curiously like all the other natives, but Harrington deemed it appropriate to point a rifle at her so that she would stop. Luckily, Colonel Reynolds managed to defuse the situation before it got worse, and Harrington ended up being reprimanded by both the colonel and the regimental master sergeant. We were here to win over the natives after all, and pointing guns and scaring them half to death clearly wasn't going to make us look good to these villagers. Aside from that incident, however, the next few minutes were uneventful, as the men of the regiment did their best to find shade and get as much rest as they could before the long march to nowhere resumed. Sadly, this respite did not last long, and after half an hour the regiment was soon ordered to columns in order to continue the march. However, as the rest of the men formed up and got into line, me, and 25 others were told to stay behind and form a small garrison detachment for the village, under the command of Lieutenant Butler. Ordered to protect the lines of supply and communication against insurgent attacks, the job had the privilege of getting us away from the long hot marches under the tropical sun. To us lucky fellows selected, it was a nice change of pace, especially now in the summer season when marching along the open fields and thick jungles felt like hell. It also brought the additional comfort of getting to sleep in actual buildings, which was far better than sleeping on a blanket sprawled on the ground. But garrison duty was not without its disadvantages, as it also meant sentry duty and patrols, as well as all the dangers that came after it. Standing guard by a rice paddy and watching Indians work may sound innocent and mundane at first, but do not be fooled, because a lone goop marksman may be hiding in the thickets, ready to take the fatal shot. Patrols were even worse, and most likely even more dangerous, since it often meant small teams of 3 to 4 men going around the jungle, hunting for insurgents and making sure that none of them were gathering for an attack against the garrison. Out there, such a small team would be outnumbered, and one small ambush could mean complete annihilation. Despite its dangers and risk though, patrols were essential and it kept the garrison safe, so it had to be done. Because of these things, garrison duty was not for the lazy. Although being less fatigue-inducing, it was no vacation. One still had to be alert, if not more alert, when placed into this position, and only those who acted well independently were often chosen. Such a quality was important, especially when you realized that a small detachment of 25 could be surrounded by as much as 100 insurgents who lurked around the nearby jungle. To help us hold the garrison, despite our small numbers, various outposts were made in different parts of the village so that we would have good defendable positions against enemy attacks. We quickly got to work on these outposts and spent a good portion of the day filling up bags with dirt and using it to create rudimentary fighting positions. In the end we managed to build 4, with outpost number 1 facing towards the northern entrance of the village, outpost number 2 facing the southern entrance of the village, outpost number 3 overlooking the rice paddies to the east of the village, and outpost number 4 watching over the small stream on the western edge of the village. Meanwhile, the stone chapel at the center of the village acted both as a barracks and citadel, where we would fall back if things got pretty bad. To further improve the security of the garrison, picket lines were also posted. These pickets formed a ring around the garrison, with a man posted 100 feet away from his nearest comrade. Ordered to lie down in some undergrowth and keep quiet all night, the pickets would keep an eye out for the enemy, and if they see an insurgent approaching, they will fire their rifle to alert the garrison of an impending attack. With the alert sounded, the pickets would then pull back and return to the village, while the whole garrison took up their posts and prepared to meet the incoming enemy attack. Left isolated and alone in the night, this was a dangerous and terrifying job. But like all the others, it had to be done. For this village, we had a picket of 7 men every night, with the first batch guarding from sundown to midnight, before being relieved by the second batch who went on from midnight to sunrise. During our first night there, I was unlucky enough to be chosen for the first batch. Tired and weary from building outposts, I really wish I could have slept instead. But without any other choice, I did my best to gather all my remaining energy and determination or else risk falling asleep. If that happened, I would be lucky if I woke up to see the master sergeant angrily glaring at me, since more often than not, a picket who falls asleep ends up being decapitated by an insurgent. Marching out to our picket line at 6 o'clock that evening, I ended up being posted at a thicket northeast from the village, just at the edge of the jungle. I managed to find a small depression on the ground which was surrounded by tall grass and decided that it was the perfect place to keep hidden in. Lying there in my position, I knew that I was now completely alone in my little hole. The nearest people from my position were around 100 feet away, with Harry somewhere on my right, and another soldier from the detachment, a certain Private Daniel Walker, positioned somewhere to my left. The village, which was behind me and across the rice paddies, was nearly 200 feet away. Ahead of me, where my focus was to be throughout my watch, was nothing but thick jungle, whose nightlife gave out the constant eerie noise that made the place sound awake even in the dark. This was nothing new for me, and I was accustomed to hearing such noises before. I was no raw meat after all, and I wouldn't be frightened by the strange noises of the jungle. It did pose a challenge though, as it made it difficult to listen for the sound of footsteps. The noise clearly worked in favor of the gooks, who could crawl around and have the jungle noise cover his sounds. That's why all pickets had to be extra cautious and listen careful to any noise that could resemble the sound of a sneaking man. So quietly I listened, keeping my guard up as best I could. Home was near, and I wasn't going to let any gook itching for a Yankee head stop me from getting there. Nothing much exciting happened, at least not until the fourth hour of my watch when I heard the sound of flapping wings coming from my rear. I did not dare shift my body around to take a look, or else risk making noise that would give away my position. I did, however, recognize the sound, since I heard it many times before. The sound was distinct enough for me to identify it as a bat, which wasn't too uncommon to find in this part of the country. There was nothing out of the ordinary with bats, and I had just assumed that there must be a colony somewhere near here. I did worry though that the bat could have been a bloodsucker, and the fact that it came flying somewhere behind me meant that it probably took a visit at the village. At the time, I concluded that it must have had some dinner there, taking a bite one of the native villagers or the billeted soldiers. Such a thought just filled me with dismay, as I realized that not only would we have to contend with the mosquitoes at night, but we now also had to worry about the bats. Knowing that nothing much could be done about them, I pushed away my thought, or else let it distract me even further, and returned my focus to my job. I did, however, continue to hear the bat fly around, and I did find it quite odd at how heavy its wings sounded. The sound of its flapping sounded large and heavy, and I feared that it might have been a bigger bat than I had initially thought. Further fears and thoughts were soon forgotten though, when I heard the bat fly away and disappear somewhere to the jungle at my left. The next few minutes were once again filled with silence, until the sound of a gunshot erupted from my left. It was the sound of a Springfield rifle going off, and it came from the direction where Walker should be. Going on instinct, I immediately pushed my rifle through the tall grass and gazed at the jungle ahead of me. Scanning the darkness, I checked if there were any signs of insurgents to my front. Once I was sure there were none, I swiftly got up from my little hole and sprinted back towards the village. Jumping into the rice paddies, I ended up getting my shoes and pants wet and covered in mud. Cursing at this, I remember feeling frustrated at how dirty I was getting as I swore that better not be a false alarm caused by Walker mistaking the bat as a gook. Reaching the outskirts of the village, I was immediately greeted by Master Sergeant Taylor, who quickly questioned me on what had happened. Telling him that the shot came from where Walker was, he gave me a curt nod before ordering me to outpost number 3. Once there, I spent the next hour on high alert, as the garrison awaited the insurgents to come. They never did though. After an hour of waiting, Lieutenant Butler ordered us to stand down. We were soon informed that during the head count, Master Sergeant Taylor noticed that Walker was missing and concluded that he was probably still out there in the jungle. Fearing that the insurgents must have got to him, and knowing that he couldn't risk losing another man in his small garrison, Lieutenant Butler decided not to order any more pickets for the night, and instead just doubled the guards on sentry duty at the outposts. The next morning, with the sun's glow now replacing the darkness, a small patrol was sent out to look for Walker. Having been able to get some sleep after being stood down, I was allowed to join the patrol to check and find out what happened to our lost comrade. None of us were hopeful, however, as we knew the fate that befell men who got killed or caught by the insurgents. Decapitated heads, chopped off fingers, these were just some of the unfortunate things they did to the corpses of our men, and it was done in hopes of instilling fear in our ranks. Well, it worked. Led by Master Sergeant Taylor, me, Morgan, and a Private Walter Walsh headed towards the last known location of Walker. We all expected the worst but were shocked to see that Walker was still in the same place where he was assigned last night. However, as we got closer, any small hope that we had of him just being injured quickly disappeared. Lying face first on the ground, Walker looked stiff and pale. There was no doubt in our minds that he was dead, although we were quite curious at the current state he was in. It seemed to us that his corpse was very pale, and a closer examination of his body showed that his skin was wrinkled. Getting closer though, we soon discovered that it wasn't just wrinkled, but completely dry, with the skin clinging to the bone. The only good way to describe it is if you think of a raisin, because that's how he looked like. Another odd thing about the whole scene was that his rifle was just by his side, while his ammunition belt was still wrapped around his body. This was strange, since the insurgents often took the weapons and ammunition of their victims. Grabbing his shoulder to flip his body, I felt my hand squeeze him to the bone, as if there was no muscle or fat in between. Once I flipped him, an even more terrifying sight was exposed to us. Eyes completely wide and white, expression frozen in full terror and fear, and facial skin dried and gripping tightly to the bone so that it looked like a skull with skin wrapped around it. Walker's face looked right at us as if he had seen hell itself. Examining his body for any signs of wounds, we were repulsed to discover that his body seemed to be completely empty between the skin and bone. Patting him all over, we felt no firmness at all, as we felt nothing but the bone inside of him. Feeling around his gut, I felt no fat, muscle, or any internal parts through his skin. All I felt was the hard bone of his vertebrae. Baffled by this, we wondered what terrible trick or device the insurgents had used to do this to him. To be able to pull out a man's internal parts without a single sign of an opening, that seemed to be unheard of till now. From what we could tell, the only sign of harm on his was the dried blood on his mouth. In the end, we could not figure out what truly happened to him. My best guess was that they somehow managed to restrain him and force him to endure the horrible method of gutting they had. To make things worse, he most likely was still alive to feel it all. This thought still gives me shiver from fear, and I try not to imagine how awful it would have looked. Whatever it was though, it clearly was excruciatingly painful, as the look of horror on Walker's face showed it. Grabbing Walker's remains at both ends, Morgan and Walsh carried the body back to the village, while Master Sergeant Taylor and I trailed behind them, covering the rear just in case there were still some insurgents lurking and waiting to pounce. Before moving the body, Master Sergeant Taylor placed blankets he had with him on top of Walker's corpse. He had originally brought these blankets in case we found Walker decapitated, so that we can cover his severed head to save what remained of his dignity. They still proved useful though, as the makeshift shroud of blankets prevented the villagers from seeing the full extent of his deceased state. Master Sergeant Taylor did not want any of the natives seeing Walker's body, since he thought it would encourage some of them to support the insurgents after seeing how harm they can impose on us soldiers. Presented to Lieutenant Butler inside the confines of the chapel, the officer ended up being as baffled as we were. However, seeing that nothing more could be done for Walker, he ordered a burial team to dig him a grave, and this would be done later that night, when none of the natives could see. The rest of my day was spent on sentry duty, and I was assigned to guard the small stream on the western side of the village. Standing by the water's edge and watching the native women clean their clothes in the water, I couldn't help but notice how one of them stood apart from the rest. While all the other women were grouped together with their families, she on the other hand had no group. It wasn't that the other women were avoiding her though, since I saw her engage in friendly conversation with others. It was more that she seemed out of place, like she had no group of her own. I found this strange, since all the women seemed to be grouped with their families. She, however, was alone. I asked Jose, our native scout, about this when he came by the stream, and he told me that the girl was an outsider. Apparently, he had a conversation with her yesterday, after Harrington pointed a rifle at her, and he learned that she used to live in a far-off village that was a victim of an insurgent reprisal attack. She claims to be the only survivor of the attack, and she traveled to this village because she had an uncle who lived here. Unfortunately for her though, her uncle went to the mountains to fight with the insurgents. Despite this, the villagers were kind enough to let her stay in her uncle's old home and were friendly enough to help her around. However, despite being kind to her, Jose told me that the community hasn't fully accepted her yet. It had only been less than a week since she arrived here, and although they were kind and happy to help, the villagers were also a bit cautious with her, since they believed she carried an aura of bad luck. To be the only survivor of a massacre marked her in the eyes of these superstitious people. Speaking of superstitious, after relating this story to me, Jose then went off to look for coconuts. Earlier that day, Jose had heard about the fate of Walker and had seen for himself the terrible state of the corpse. Horrified and frightened by it, he was temporarily overcome by panic as he kept on mentioning some kind of mythical creature that hunts for victims at night and eats their organs. Of course, we all found this ridiculous, and did our best to calm him down. Once we did though, Master Sergeant Taylor made it clear to him not to tell the villagers any information about Walker's death. He must have realized that if the thought of this mythical creature caused this much panic to a seasoned scout, then what more could it do to these superstitious villagers? Jose though was happy to keep quiet and reminded us that we were his employers and so it meant he will always follow our orders. However, that apparently did not stop him from making plans to create special oil that was supposed to ward off the creature he was talking about. I do not remember all the components he said, but I do remember that one of the ingredients was coconut. So off he went to look for one. I thought him a naive person to believe such things, but he was a reliable and loyal scout. When night came, I once again was struck by bad luck and was assigned sentry duty from sundown to midnight. Despite my dismay at being given another first watch, I was at least relieved that I did not get picket duty. Whatever happened to Walker still terrified me, and being assigned to guard the outposts made me feel safer. Assigned to outpost number 1, I arrived at my post at around 6 o'clock. Once I got there, I noticed Jose walking around the defensive position and tying bulbs of garlic on the 4 corners of the outpost's Nipper roof. Asking him on why he was tying garlic around the outpost, he told me that garlic was a known counter for the night creature he called the Mandarugo. He claims that garlic wards them off and prevents them from going near. He then went on to saying that he gave each member of the picket 1 bulb each, to help protect them through the night. I found this funny, because it reminded me of stories about vampires and how garlic helped repel them. I also chuckled at the idea that the men on picket duty were lying in the jungle with a bulb of garlic with them. For added protection, he also carried around a canteen which he said contained some kind of special oil that was supposed to boil when the Mandarugo was nearby. All of this just sounded ridiculous, and yet Jose really believed every one of it. To me, I thought that Jose was wasting his time over nothing. The state of Walker's corpse was indeed horrifying and traumatizing, but there was no use attributing it to some kind of mythical creature. I was more scared of the insurgent than the stories Jose was telling me, because I knew that the insurgents were real and wanted to murder me and my friends. For over a year, the insurgents had done everything to kill or frighten us. Every tactic they to make me to stop fighting was used, from simply eliminating me with bullets, bolos, and traps, to more elaborate and gruesome strategies, such as demoralizing me by displaying the decapitated or maimed bodies of my comrades. With such experiences, I did not think it below them to invent new means of torture, just like what they did to Walker. The insurgents probably just discovered some kind of method of gutting a person through the mouth, one that replicated the supposed killing habits of this Mandarugo. They probably predicted that our native scouts would tell us about such creatures, just like what Jose did. Hoping that such stories would frighten us, the insurgents most likely thought that we would become demoralized and terrified by it, while our native scouts would be scared off and leave us behind. To me, the real monsters were the insurgents, not some kind of mythical night creature. Of course, I did not tell Jose that, and even if I did, I doubted he would have believed me. Myths like that were firmly ingrained on their poorly educated Indian minds, and there was nothing I could have done to change that. So instead, I allowed Jose to continue whatever it was he planned on doing. Once he was done tying all the garlic bulbs, he moved on to the next outpost to repeat the ritual. I watched him scurry off, hearing him complain how he might not have enough garlic to save for himself, before placing my attention and full focus to my duty of guarding the northern part of the village. The night was quiet, aside from the usual noise of the jungle. Standing in the outpost, I made occasional glances at the dark landscape before me, keeping an eye for anything suspicious. By 11 o'clock, with nothing eventful happening, I was convinced that it was going to be a peaceful night. Around that time, I heard the sound of a bat flying, and I stood there in dismay, remembering that this village was infested with bats. I remember that I was hoping once again that the bats there were not blood-sucking. Staring at my front, I did my best not to think of the bats and instead focused my attention on the distant jungle, trying to see if there were any insurgents gathering there. But the foliage was too thick, and the sound of the bat flying was distracting me too much, as it seemed to be getting closer to me. At that point, I remember preparing myself for an imminent visit from the bat. By the loud sound of its wings, it seemed quite obvious that it was heading for me. Worrying that it could have been a bloodsucker, I thought that it might get a bite of dinner out from me. Because of that, I got ready to repel the bat. However, when I turned around to see where the bat was, I saw something that I was not prepared for. Floating a few feet behind my outpost and staring directly at me was a strange creature that sent a terrible fright through my whole body. From what I can remember, the creature was essentially a flying torso, ugly, naked and bare, with long bone-thin arms that had claw-like fingers on its hands. Underneath the torso were guts hanging out of its bottom, as if it had everything from the stomach down chopped off. Atop the torso was its thin head, with long dark hair and piercing black eyes. Staring at those eyes seemed equal to staring at emptiness itself, and it was enough to drain the energy from even the strongest man. I did my best not to stare at those eyes, or else be lost with fear from it. However, that was not the most terrifying feature about the horrendous creature. What scared me the most was its long snake-like tongue, which protruded out of its smiling mouth and extended at least 5 feet out of it. Letting my eyes drift towards it, I remember seeing a sharp point at the end of the tongue, with its sharp resembling that of a spear. I was terrified to my bones, and as I watched it float, I noticed the bat-like wings attached to its back. A sudden thought occurred to me at this moment, as I realized that this was the bat I heard a few seconds ago. Then a deeper thought entered my mind, as I began to realize that this must have been the bat I heard the previous night. If that was so, then was it possible that this creature attacked Walker and done the horrendous act of gutting him? At that moment, it seemed that Jose was right after all. His Mandarugo may not have been as mythical as I originally thought. But any thought of regret for not believing Jose was quickly lost when this hideous creature suddenly lunged towards me, its corpse-like body angling forward as its empty eyes managed to show a look of hunger. Petrified with fear, I found myself unable to move or do anything. How was one to react after seeing such creature? Was this what Walker felt when the creature came to him last night? At that moment, I finally understood why his face had the look of fear engraved on it. Standing stiffly with my rifle clutched in my hands, my mind was unable to formulate a defense. I was helpless, and all I could do was imagine the horrors it will do to me. Like Walker, I would be gutted and left as an empty corpse for the next guard on duty to find. I wanted to scream, I wanted to fight back, but my throat felt dry during that moment, and the aura of fear this creature radiated prevented my muscles from following instinct. I was helpless. However, as the creature got closer to my outpost, it suddenly stopped and hissed. Narrowing its eyes at something, it stared at my outpost with a look of disgust, as it let out another hissing sound. Its long tongue was slithering in the air, moving up and forward as it aimed at me. But the creature moved no closer, and instead looked at me with what looked like a combination of anger and hunger. Staring back at it, I still felt too terrified to move. I just watched as it hissed and stared at me. I remember wondering why it did not attack, before remembering what Jose had done to my outpost. Did his garlic really work? Was its smell enough to dissuade the foul creature? Seeing it fly there and not move an inch closer to me, I believe it did. For a good long while, the creature just floated there, and I did not know what to do to get rid of it. I was no expert in fighting such strange things like this, and anything Jose had thought my earlier was forgotten by my naive past self. So for a good few minutes, the two of us were in a stalemate, with me frozen by its terrifying aura, while the creature was unable to move further because of the garlic. The only thing that broke this standoff was the sudden sound of a rifle shot from the picket line, which followed by another and another. Although distant, the sudden eruption of gunfire seemed to scare the creature off, as it made one long hiss towards me, before flying off, its wings beating fast as it went up into the air, disappearing into the darkness of the night. Finally able to move, yet drained from what just happened, I suddenly collapsed inside the outposts, feeling weak and numb. I was lucky, I knew that, but also realized how close I was to sharing the same fate with Walker. So there I was, lying on the outpost, not caring about anything, except for the image of the creature engraved into my mind. Even as the sound of gunfire increased all over the village, I just laid there, unable to move as I was lost in thought. It was only when Morgan and Harry arrived at the outpost did I finally snap out of my trance. They had initially thought that I had been hit by an insurgent marksman when they saw me on the ground, but once they saw I was fine, they instead cursed at me, thinking I had fallen asleep at my post. The insurgents were attacking, they had said, and this was no time to be slacking off. Slowly returning to my senses, I got up and took my position next to them. Explaining to them what happened to me, I told them that there was some sort of creature that came by the outpost and I was lucky enough to survive my encounter with it. I then offered the idea that maybe it was not the insurgents that got to Walker, but instead that strange creature. However, they scoffed at my suggestion, thinking that I had fallen asleep and started dreaming about the myths Jose was scaring the garrison with. But I knew what I saw, and I know that I did not fall asleep. I was no inexperienced recruit that would make that mistake. The creature was real, it came at me. But I made no further efforts to insist it to them, it was useless. They would react the same way I reacted when Jose first told me about the Mandarugo. So, in order to save breath and frustration, I kept my silence. I realized that only those who saw it for themselves will believe me. The next hour was spent with the garrison on full alert, as the picket lines were pulled back as an insurgent's attack occurred. Trying my best to forget my encounter with the creature, I tried to keep my focus on the ground in front of me, hunting for the silhouettes of the insurgent attackers. However, once in a while, I could not help but glance behind us, just to make sure that the creature was not there hungrily staring at us. The fighting ended up being a tough one, with a constant stream of bullets flying from both sides. After a while, my glances to the rear became less and less, as the immediate threat were the attacking insurgents. For a moment, I forgot about the creature as bullets started landing all over our position, forcing us to hunker down. Most of the shots passed over our position, however, with only a few hits on the dirt-filled bags that protected us. Spotting the muzzle flashes of the insurgent rifles, we immediately returned fire, and for the next hour we traded shots with the attacking gooks. The enemy tried their best to keep hidden throughout most of the fight, and aside from the flashes of the rifles, we never did see a single insurgent. But that did not stop us from pouring out a heavy rate of fire as we let loose our guns on the enemy. At one point, it seemed that we were firing more than we usually did during encounters. I like to believe that this over-enthusiasm was because of what happened to Walker, as the men of the garrison let out their frustration and anger by letting the enemy know what a hell made of lead felt like. But this anger was directed at the wrong direction, and although I did not like the insurgents, I knew that there was a greater danger to us than a gook with a gun and bolo. By midnight the fighting had stopped, and aside from a few pot shots from some overeager soldiers, most of the firing had trickled down. A loud cheer then erupted from all around the defensive line, as men cheered and taunted the insurgents for failing in their attack. In the end, our casualties were 1 wounded and no dead. At least, that's what we initially thought after the head count. It did not take long before someone reported that Jose had been killed in the fighting, as his body was found behind the chapel. But it was not any bullet that got him, and as I was ordered to help carry his body inside chapel, I saw an all too familiar sight. Dry pale skin that hugged the bones, empty white eyes, a terrified expression on his face, and no signs of wounds except for some blood on the mouth. All these things closely resembled what had happened to Walker. Just like Walker, his weapons and equipment were left behind too, with Jose's bolo knife, rifle, and canteen were lying sprawled on the ground. I felt a chill overcome me at the sight of his corpse, and I had to fight off the urge to suddenly rush back to the outpost and seek protection there. Managing to fight this urge and keep quiet, I knew that I could have told them all about my encounter with the creature. But remembering the reaction of Morgan and Harry, my 2 closest friends, had when I told them, I ultimately decided against it. They would not have believed me even if I insisted, and they will probably just mark me as a madman. Besides, the precautions Jose had done to the garrison was probably enough, at least for the outposts. I cannot say the same for the pickets, if they do not bring their garlic bulbs with them, but I knew I was going to bring one if I was sent out on picket duty. The whole garrison was dismayed and concerned by what had happened to Jose, and Lieutenant Butler ordered half the garrison to stay up all night. I was glad for this order, since I ended up being sent back to Outpost Number 1. In the end, everyone concluded that insurgent infiltrators managed to sneak in our lines, restrain Jose, and quickly conduct their torture method on him. With the whole garrison busy fighting, they believed that it prevented the men from hearing the torture. But I knew what most likely happened. Jose was most likely attacked by the creature, and I would have had the same fate if I was not protected by the garlic. Luckily for me, Jose had spent time hanging them on all the outposts. Sadly, for him, it meant that there was none left for his own protection, and that had cost him his life. For the next few hours, all of us were terrified, with me more than the rest, as I watched out for the creature. But the creature never reappeared, and I had believed that it was already satisfied by its meal, no matter how morbid that sounded. However, when the morning light came, I soon realized that it may not have been the case. As sunrise approached, we were confused to notice that none of the villagers came out of their homes to attend to their daily chores. These natives normally got up early to start work on their rice paddies, so all of us found this odd and strange. Deciding to investigate, Lieutenant Butler first went to the village chief to check on him and see if everything was all right. But once he got there, an unpleasant sight met him. Laying there on the floor of the nipa hut, the village chief, his wife, and children were all dead. To make matters worse, their corpses revealed that they were given same treatment both Walker and Jose had. Hearing that alone scared me. Disturbed and panicked by this, the disgusted Lieutenant Butler ordered us to check all the homes of the villagers. One by one we did, and each time we saw the same sight. All of the villagers, all 55 of those who lived there, had been tortured to death. From the elderly to the children, every single one of the villagers was turned into a pale, dried out, gutted corpse. All except one, that is. The outsider, the young girl who had survived a massacre in her old village, seemed to have survived another. While searching homes, one of the soldiers found her in her uncle's house, cowering in the corner. She told us that she had heard noises and some muffled screams all night, and because of that she curled up into a ball in the corner and prayed for it to end. With fate smiling at her, nothing came for her that night. She was lucky, and even I thought of that too. Although the others thought she was lucky that the insurgent infiltrators did not find her, my thoughts were that she was lucky because the creature did not get to her. I did, however, find her luck to be not completely good, since she has become a witness to another massacre. The rest of the day was spent burying the villagers. I had never buried so many people in one day, and I hoped that I would never have to again. A courier was also sent to the regiment to inform Colonel Reynolds what had happened. When the next day came, a company from the regiment was sent in to bolster our numbers. I knew that more soldiers were probably not going to be enough to stop the creature, but the fact that no more gutted corpses were found showed that it at least prevented it from making further attacks. We spent 3 more days in the village, fighting off insurgent attacks that seemed to become more and more ferocious. After that, we were ordered to rejoin our regiment, as a company from a regular regiment came in to replace us. The girl was left to their custody, and their captain told us that she would most likely be relocated to another nearby village. I did not worry much for her, because I knew that she had some luck in her. I did, however, worry for the village she would live in. The Indians' belief on the superstitious was proving to be true, and at that point I believed that she indeed carries a bad aura around her. Wherever she ended up, I just hoped it was free of insurgents or that terrible Mandarugo. I learned a lot from my experiences in that village. Ever since then, I always made sure to keep a bulb of garlic with me at all times and to always look behind me at night in case a creature has chosen me as its prey. Thinking about these events, I found my great-great-grandfather's unpublished memoirs in the attic of my grandparents' home. Along with his memoirs, I also found an old rusty BOLO knife, a deteriorated campaign hat, and an old canteen. I remember seeing this all before as a kid, but didn't think much of it then. However, with a trip to visit my girlfriend's relatives in the Philippines coming soon, I thought it would be cool to look through his old stuff and learn about his experiences in that country. I read his memoirs in hopes of making a map of his time there, so that I can possibly visit them and try to see what he saw. However, after reading this chapter in his memoirs, I don't feel so keen on visiting those places anymore. But that is not the reason I am sharing this to you all. The reason I am posting this is because I need advice. You see, after reading the memoirs, I decided to visit my girlfriend at her apartment to show her my great-great-grandfather stuff. After handing her the memoir, I was about to show her the old canteen next when I noticed something odd. The canteen was warm, as if there was something boiling inside. Thank you for watching. If you like the video, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification for updates, and see you in the next video.